Knutsford is one of those rare English towns which is immortalised in literature. The town in the classic novel Cranford is Knutsford. In Georgian times, Knutsford's social, economic and cultural life reflected the splendour of the surrounding estates. It was a seed plot for the gentry and the 5th largest town in Cheshire. There's a tradition of sanding the streets on special occasions, a custom unique to Knutsford. King Street was the hub of the old town, and the architecture is largely Georgian, with some Tudor and Victorian dotted in between. Looking down the narrow winding street, we can pick out the Heritage Centre, the focus of historical Knutsford. The young people at the gate are entwined with ribbons of the dance, an evocation of May Day on the heath. Inside we pass Green Man, the symbol of continuous regeneration, and beyond is the old smithy, which is now the exhibition centre. Tucked inside the alley is a Victorian photograph taken in the yard of the working smithy. The Groundwork Trust rescued and renovated the building and designed the permanent display. Entrance to the exhibition centre is free, and you can browse around historical Knutsford at your leisure. I'm John Howard.
And I'm Joan Leach.
We shall be your guides to the programme, and John is going to start the Knutsford story at the turn of the first millennium.
Legend has it that Knutsford means Knutsford across the River Lily. The spelling CNUT is Scandinavian, and it is pronounced Canute. As you can see from these place names, many Scandinavians had settled in Cheshire by the first millennium. One of the place names is Toft, and Canute could have been a local person. However, according to legend, the person is King Canute, whose effigy sits behind me. And here is another, on this Canute penny, which is about the size of a 5p piece. Unfortunately, medieval historians advise caution, because there is no record that King Canute came to the northwest. Now, the earliest written record of the name Knutsford is the Domesday entry. It bears a very close resemblance to Knutsford, but it was written by 12th century Normans to be read by Normans, and we cannot draw conclusions about its pronunciation or the meaning of the name. Now, the Knutsford Charter of 1292 is held in the Chester Record Office, and here we find a version of the spelling which fits well with the topographical interpretation. For instance, the English word canotter and Danish canotter are cognate words meaning hillock or lump, so Knutsford could be the ford at the bottom of the hillock. Alternatively, if it's a knot or a tie, then the ford could tie the upper moraine, Mollypots Moor, with the lower moraine, the Knutsford Moor. So if you don't believe the legend of King Canute, then the origin of the name is uncertain. 50 years later, in 1070, certainty arrived with ruthless savagery. William the Conqueror, having devastated Yorkshire and put down the mutiny in his own army, came to Cheshire to put down the uprising in Mercia and to establish Cheshire as a military stronghold against the Welsh. The Saxon landlords were replaced by Normans, and the names are recorded in the Domesday Book of 1086. We are fortunate to have a facsimile of the Domesday Book, so let's look at the Knutsford entry. It is written in abbreviated Latin, and that red line through the name is literally a highlighter. The text translates as, Knutsford is held by the Norman William Fitznigel. It doesn't say this, but he was next in rank to the Earl of Chester. The Saxon landlord was Erkebrand, and he is now holding it as a subtenant. The fact that Erkebrand holds the land is an achievement, because only 6 of the Saxon landlords in Cheshire held on to their manors in 1070. The other 124 were either killed, became outlaws, or dropped down the social ladder. Erkebrand must pay tax on the basis of half a hide. A hide, by the way, is the amount of land to support a peasant household. There are no people in Knutsford, so whatever community was there in Canute's time had disappeared. The land was waste and is waste, which means the land was unusable in 1070 and is still unusable in 1086. Finally, it says there is a wood, half a league by 11 perches, and the pre-1070 tax was 10 shillings. The next milestone in Knutsford's history was the Charter of 1292. The kings had come up with a wheeze for raising revenue. The king owned all the land and would sell a charter for a one-off payment. In 1292, William de Tabley bought a charter for Knutsford from Edward I. In the town there were 38 burgess plots, and the terms of the charter spelt out what the burgesses were entitled to in terms of arable land and pastures for his animals, the entitlement to pass on inheritance, and a stall on market day, which was Saturday. In return, the burgesses had to render their third best pig and pay a yearly rent of 12 pence. They had to grind their corn at their lord's mill and pay for the privilege. Within the four gates of the town, they could not build an oven, and they had to bake their bread at their lord's baker. They also had to pay for that privilege. William de Tabley thought he had it made, but his overlord, Richard de Massey of Tatton, was well versed in the law, and after 2 years of legal argument, half the Burgess plots became part of the Tatton estate, the start of a relationship which would last until 1958. Now, life in a 13th century town is well illustrated by these scenes taken from a recent mural by Oliver Postgate. Everyone believed that earthly life was no more than the prologue to the real life to come after death. To this end, Earl Hugh, the warlord put in by William the Conqueror to rule Cheshire, became a monk a few days before his death. God's agent on earth was the church. The king, for all his earthly power, was answerable to God, and the king had to tread carefully if his powers overlapped those of the archbishop. If the king challenged the authority of the church, the pope could call an interdict, and the clergy would come out on strike. They refused to minister at christenings and funerals, and the faithful from the serfs to the king would have their ticket to heaven removed. It would be a downhill path from then on, something they all lived in fear of. In everyday town life, we today would be nauseated by the overwhelming stench. If you were low-born, life would be risky and dangerous. You would have been hungry and fleet of foot. If, however, you attached yourself to the household of some rich person, then at least you would get food to eat and some measure of protection. Your master may well be a drunken bully, but in his service you were fairly safe. There was a lot of violence and very little justice for the poor. This is the site of the medieval Booths Hall, and its owner, John de Lee, became well acquainted with the justice system in the early 1300s. Military matters took precedence over other parts of the county's administration, and the county had a reputation for lawlessness and disorder. Aggravated burglary was commonplace. There were felons who gained pardon by military service, but experienced in the practices of war did not prove to be good citizens. In 1375, the Buckley family laid siege to Vale Royal Abbey and ran a protection racket in Nantwich. The law officers were often negligent and corrupt, and the gentry warred amongst themselves. One of these gentry was John de Lee, who was known locally as John the Bad. His manor house, the original Booths Hall, was surrounded by this moat, which was the largest in Cheshire. The half-timbered hall would have been very similar to this one at Little Morton. John the Bad was to follow the legal profession before turning to lead a group of minor gentry in a series of criminal raids. Under the guise of assisting Edward II, he raided and looted in Manchester. In 1327, he murdered 7 people, and in an argument over a common boundary, killed his good neighbour, Sir William de Mobley. However, he was well connected and able to obtain a pardon from Edward III. He then entered the royal service and was able to live out a life of quiet respectability. Justice had certainly smiled very kindly on John de Lee.
Our story isn't strictly chronological, and we are now going to look at some of Old Knutsford as it is today. In the 18th century, the Royal George was a noted coaching inn and posting house on the route from Liverpool to London. Through the arch, these cobbles would have echoed to the clatter of horses' hooves and iron-bound carriage wheels. The plan shows extensive stables for resting the horses, and the buildings above them house the coaches. The ostlers and coachmen didn't frequent the George. They would retire to the spit and sawdust of the George Tap, which is now the King Canute. In the 17th century, the Royal George was the George and Dragon, and there is a cast of the famous drama on both sides of the arch. However, 5 years before she became Queen, Princess Victoria dined here, and following that, St. George was replaced by Royal George, and the poor dragon disappeared. The 18th century clientele was very high class, for the gentry from the estates had built these assembly rooms by their joint subscription. One of the maids bragged that none but gentility were admitted, but on no account any tradesmen. The ladies would float up the shallow pitched stairs in their crinolines, and the ball would be an occasion of elegance and style. The musicians played from the gallery, and the whole scene was one of spacious grandeur. Back into King Street, and in 1839 Knutsford was rocked by the collapse of the Imperial Bank of England, which occupied these premises. In Cranford, Miss Mattie's modest income was shattered, and she was fortunate to be saved by the generosity of the maid and her husband, who moved in and took responsibility for the rent. Despite this rearrangement in the economic order, they continued to pay her the deference which was due to a woman of quality. The oldest building in the row is this one, dating back to 1697. It was built by Henry Antrobus, a wealthy mercer, who left a huge sum of £800 to be used for the maintenance of apprentices. It is now administered as the Nether Knutsford Educational Foundation. The Hollands own the house at the end of this row, and it is where Sir Henry Holland was born. He was physician to royalty, including the wife and the mistress of George IV, William IV, Queen Victoria, and he was in attendance when Prince Albert died. He practised in London, but even so, the Edgertons sent for him when their daughter was dying at Tatton. It is the Holland family motto, "Look to the past, the present and the future," which is carried on the Knutsford coat of arms. His son, Sir Henry Thurston Holland, was Secretary of State for the Colonies in 1887, and when he moved to the Lords, he sought the approval of the Edgertons before he adopted the title Lord Knutsford. Ever since, there has been a seat in the House of Lords for the hereditary owner of the title. This photograph shows Titus Lee's ironmonger's shop, and it is still an ironmonger's today. It must be the oldest business in Knutsford, for this front was built in 1785. Prior to that, the buildings didn't sit neatly along King Street, but were arranged in higgledy-piggledy fashion, and the business was run from this shop at the back. In those days, the ironmonger ran a complete service, including the repair of baths, buckets, pans, etc. The repairs would be done by the tinsmith opposite, whose workshop had all the kit, including a block to produce handmade nails. Now this 1877 map clearly shows the old marketplace, where the Charter of 1292 established the Saturday market. This was the centre of the old town, and the old market hall stood here until 1960. The room above the arches had been the courthouse and town hall until 1872, and from here the ordinary citizens were obligated to serve as unpaid inspectors for 1 year. They could be heath lookers, way wardens, well lookers, and if luck was on your side, you could be an ale taster. At the weekly market, the town crier with his bell would announce bear baiting, cockfighting, and for some, the entertainment wasn't complete without a public flogging. Of the old marketplace, only the steps and steps which led down to it are here today. The site of the old town hall is now occupied by apartments. Just down from the old marketplace are the last houses to be built by the Edgertons. As lords of the manor, they had a good record of civic duty and benevolence towards the town, but those houses, built in the 1930s, were to mark the end of manorial patronage. Back up the steps into King Street, and in Mrs. Gaskell's day, the shop with the 2 black and white gables was a high-class drapers and grocers, offering 8 grades of tea. The business supported both the Jacksons who owned it, together with 6 apprentices and 5 staff. All of them lived on the premises. It was here that Miss Mattie learned about the bank failure, because the proprietor refused to accept her banknote. Looking around, some of the supports are restoration, but those roof beams are the originals. The White Lion pub is the best example of Jacobean timberwork in the town. With good eyesight, you can just make out the date of 1687 in the big crossbeam. Bonnie Prince Charlie's soldiers were welcomed here on his march to Derby, but after the rebellion was crushed, it was a different story on the way back. The soldiers tried to remind the landlord that he'd called them the pillars of the realm. "Aye, maybe I did," said the landlord, "but I meant caterpillars," and he refused to let them in. The joiners' marks are still in evidence on the old timbers, and in those days they knew better than to say "meet you at the Lion." There was also a Golden Lion, and the courtyard next door belonged to the Red Lion. This is now home to the Penny Farthing Museum, and if you've got what it takes, you can ride one of those bikes from end to end. One man who has done it is Glyn Stockdale, the owner of the museum.
When it was first conceived, the penny farthing really spanned a 20-year period, and my ambition was to get the ultimate model from each year of manufacture. Most are hanging up in the roof. Some are away on exhibition elsewhere, and some are being ridden at this moment on the road. We lend them out for races and charity events, and they're all in working order. They were developed from 1872 to 1892, when the chain-driven bicycle proved to be superior. This one is the last of the line. It's half the weight of the first machines and is fitted with a pneumatic tyre. The tangent spokes are better for hill climbing, and the small front driving wheel is geared to one twice its size. When you bought a penny farthing in Victorian days, you went into a shop and they measured your inside leg measurement. That determined the diameter of wheel you could drive. This is the Starley Giant, and the wheel is 7 foot in diameter. It's a frightening thing to ride, and if it came over, its weight would crush you. Probably certainly break a leg or an odd bone or two. With the advent of the penny farthing, the working man could now get out into the country. He'd previously only really been able to go by train. The Manchester Bicycle Club and the Liverpool Anfield Club both used to come to Knutsford for afternoon tea on a Sunday. And they wore a uniform, much to the alarm of the local people, who regarded them as invaders or some type of militia.
Well then, how do you get onto one of these things?
Let's take one out into Town Park and show you how it's done.
Starting on a flat surface, you stand behind the bicycle, and with your foot on the rear step, you scoot along, keeping the bicycle in a straight line. When you have sufficient momentum, you lift yourself up carefully. The big wheel is a beautiful machine to ride, very silent and very smooth despite the solid tyre. You go along at the height of a horse and see all kinds of things you're not supposed to see. In the year 2000, we're going to hold the next Knutsford Great Race. It's a charity event which is run every 10 years, and the international field will race for 3 hours around Knutsford Heath. It's something we're all looking forward to. And now, back to King Street.
This Georgian row hides its age well. The owners were Samuel and Ann Wright, whose initials are on the rainwater head. Samuel Wright led the campaign which created the parish of Knutsford. He and Anne were the first to be married in St John the Baptist Church. Maybe it was serendipity, maybe it was heavenly reward. Tourists to Knutsford are always attracted to Marble Arch. Until 1718, this was the Angel Inn, and before that it was the Mermaid. Riders would mount their steeds from the old block there, which now serves as a mount for geraniums. After the inn moved over the road, these cottages were used as a smithy. Above the arch are 2 very small rooms, which must have been too small for anything but sanitation. The mind boggles. As well as being a staging inn, the Angel was also a posting house until the early 1900s. When the landlord objected to being on duty at 2 a.m. to deal with the mail, he was sacked and the business went elsewhere. By 1904, the post office was back, but on the other side of the road, and its location at one end of the town wasn't popular, particularly if you lived in Crosstown. That Scott Gilbert telephone kiosk with its graceful arches and neo-Georgian windows looks part of the business, and it's easy to forget that it was until 1984. This imposing building looks like it is meant to impress. Well, it had to do just that. It was formerly the bank that failed and was relocated here after 17 years had passed. The last house on this side was donated to the parish in 1718 as a vicarage, but later the vicars chose to live elsewhere and sublet the house for rent. In Cranford, the vicar's son ran off to sea after he'd been publicly humiliated by his father. In time he returns, and this is seen as a wish fulfillment because Mrs. Gaskell's brother went to sea and disappeared in India. The writer Alice Nutley lived here before the First World War and described it as a pleasant house, but at night the creaking scared her. This is the top end of King Street in 1790, as sketched by Humphrey Repton. He had been commissioned by the Edgertons to advise on improvements to the Tatton estate, and he sketched his vision for King Street with a grand entrance to the Tatton estate which would reflect his client's importance and prestige. The cottages on the left are the weavers' cottages which stand today, and replaced the cotton mills on the right with woodland. The grand entrance was ultimately built as a Doric triumphal arch, looking out at King Street from just inside the woodland.
The history of churches in Knutsford is unusual, and it starts with the church which overlooks the lake at Rosthern. The present church dates from the 14th century with 16th century modifications, but there's been a church at Rosthern since at least 1188. At that time all churches were Roman Catholic and services were conducted in Latin. The parish is the unit of ecclesiastical administration and quite distinct from town and manor. Consequently, as late as the 1700s, the parish boundaries on this map were dominated by Great Budworth, containing 35 townships, and Rosthern, whose parish boundaries included Knutsford. In Knutsford, where the population was 10 times that of Rosthern, people either worshipped at the Chapel of Ease in King Street or walked to the church known locally as St Helena. Built by the Lees of Booth's Hall, it stood from the early 1300s until 1740 in curious isolation between Booth's Hall and the Mobley Road. When Knutsfordians preferred the proximity of the Chapel of Ease, Peter Lee found himself with an empty church, so he locked them out of the Chapel of Ease. It was all to no avail, because they broke in, he took them to court, and they won. In 1689, the Act of Toleration allowed Protestant dissenters from the Church of England to establish their own place of worship, and soon after this, the Brook Street Chapel was built. Just in case the Act of Toleration was repealed, the building was designed so that it could be converted into dwelling houses, and in those early days, a service would not be conducted without an armed lookout posted at the top of those steps. From its earliest days, the chapel has a record of appointing interesting ministers. For instance, buried inside the chapel is John Turner, to whom gown and sword were equally familiar. Then there was the literary and philanthropic Henry Green. His book, first published in 1859, is very much a people's story. It's a jolly good read and highly recommended. The success of the dissenters was particularly galling to the Orthodox worshippers. They wanted their own parish, separate from Rosthern, but this would need an Act of Parliament. It wasn't until 1741 that an Act of Parliament was passed, following a campaign led by Samuel Wright. The church was completed in 1744 at a cost of £4,000, of which £1,500 was raised by the sale of pews. This is a deed of sale. In this case, Samuel Edgerton paid £82.10 for 6 pews. The owner of a pew could rent it out, as did some of those who attended the chapel in Brook Street. St John the Baptist Church was built on the land known as Tenter's Field. The manufacture of linen was a cottage industry, and here the linen was stretched out on tenter frames to bleach in the sun. The church was built on a plinth, with quoin stones brought from St Helena, and it is built in the Georgian style, which was fashionable in those days. The 4 bells, whose peal had been heard for 250 years at St Helena, were sent to Gloucester to be recast into 5 bells, and the 6th was paid for by public subscription. The people of Knutsford heard them for the first time on the Feast of St John the Baptist in 1749. In 1996, the ring of 6 bells was increased to a ring of 8, when 2 trebles were installed to give the classical sound which you hear today. The church is now longer than the original, which was apsidal, and inside the east window there is a dedication to the Reverend Clews, who organised the reconstruction work. He didn't know it at the time, but his place in Knutsford's history was assured when he married Elizabeth Stevenson to the Reverend William Gaskell. 1855 started a flurry of church building. Coming into Knutsford from Holmes Chapel, you will undoubtedly be struck by the picturesque church of St John the Evangelist at Toft. It was built in 1855 as a memorial to Ralph Lester by his wife Emily, and it stands where she could see it from Toft Hall, in a rural setting which has hardly changed since. The Church of St Cross takes its name from the wayside cross which used to stand here. For the same reason, this part of Knutsford used to be called Crosstown. The stock, which supported the wayside cross, was used as a font for a while, but now it stands just inside the porch. Now this is the second church to be constructed here. The first church of St Cross was built by the owners of Booth's Hall in 1858, but it had to be demolished 22 years later because it was unsafe. Built on the same site, the present church, with its tower, has been a notable feature on the landscape of Knutsford ever since. John Wesley didn't get a good reception in all towns, but he did when he came to Knutsford in 1783. His word of exhortation was thankfully received by those he spoke to from these steps. At the time they belonged to the Roebuck Inn in King Street, but as you can see, the steps have been moved to the Wesleyan Chapel, which was built in 1864. The chapel was originally built with a spire, but by 1948 it became unsafe and had to be removed. The frontage belies the size of the chapel. The design is rather splendid, and recently the pews have been removed to make a more flexible auditorium. This church was built by the Congregationalists in 1866, together with a hall, schoolroom and manse. Sadly, attendance has dwindled, and it was closed in 1937 and later taken down in the 1940s. From 1866 until 1927, what is now the Little Theatre in Queen Street was the first Roman Catholic church to be built in Knutsford. Its successor was opened in 1927, but the structural malaise which affects Knutsford's churches is non-sectarian, and claimed this church by subsidence. To prevent any repetition, the present church of St Vincent de Paul is built on a raft foundation. Opened in 1983, it contrasts starkly from conventional architecture and stands in the spirit of the late 20th century. If we look at the estates surrounding Knutsford in the Domesday Book, we find 2 at Tatton, 1 at Mobley, 3 at Pever, 2 at Tabley and 1 at Mere. By 1292, most of Tatton was held by Richard de Massey, and Toft had become a working estate, most of which was owned by Roger de Toft. In the Charter of 1292, Knutsford was Nether Knutsford, which included Crossdown, and our old friend William de Tabley also owned Over Knutsford and Norbury Booths. In 1296, William de Tabley sold Over Knutsford and Norbury Booths to John de Lee. At this time, surnames were taken from the place of residence, so we have William of Tabley, Robert of Mere, John of Lee, who had come from Highley. The next big sale was that of Over Tabley in 1726, and except where detailed boundaries changed by marriage settlement, bequests and acquisition, the estates continued in being like this until the end of the 19th century. Besides being a military stronghold, Cheshire had a special relationship with the king in medieval times because the Earl of Chester was the Prince of Wales. Indeed, burgesses from the Knutsford estates were paid directly by the Black Prince, and John de Lee of Booths was in the personal bodyguard of Richard II. The families of the estates took part in the Crusades, the 100 Years' War with France, the wars with Scotland, and the Wars of the Roses. Much of this was for personal gain or preferment. During the Civil War, the parliamentarian troops in Cheshire mutinied because they hadn't been paid. Rounding up a number of county gentlemen, including the parliamentary John Lee of Booths, the Roundheads took them to Chester like rogues and thieves. Here they were held captive for 4 weeks until their friends could raise the £4,000 back pay. The Civil War had little effect on Knutsford, except that when Prince Rupert's troops camped on the heath in 1644, Knutsfordians dubbed him Prince Robber because his troops went pillaging in the town. The manors, however, were split into opposing camps, and the outcome of the war affected their futures. The royalist mayors of Mere Hall, who had lived there from the time of King John, had to sell up, while at Pever Hall, Lady Ellen Mannering, a parliamentarian, was able to present her son with an elaborate new block of stables, with an arcade of Tuscan columns dividing the stalls. Running from the 11th century to the 19th century, the manorial system reached its zenith in the 18th century, and by then the ultimate status symbol was the building of a mansion set in parkland such as this one at Tatton. All the estates commissioned new building works, and first away were the Lees of Booths, who built this hall in 1741. It has been unkindly described as a brick box, but a very nice ballroom and mezzanine were added in the early 19th century. It was finished off with a balustraded parapet, and the stone porch was added, resting on 6 pairs of columns. The Lees and Pennington Lees held the estate for 600 years, and the pub on the corner of Lee Road bears their coat of arms. The obelisk on the Chelford Road has been the subject of much speculation. However, the Ordnance Survey map, surveyed around 1875, marks it as an obelisk to Ralph Lester of Toft and his wife. Built on the Booths estate, it could be seen from both halls, lying on a straight line between them. This Elizabethan hall was the home of the Mannerings at Pever in 1764. In plan view it looked like this, but then they built on a Georgian wing, with no concessions made to the design of the old hall. It stood here looking rather uninspired until it was demolished in 1964. But you can't say that about the stables. The clock and cupola are symbolic of a serious intent, and it's where the gentry based the Cheshire Hunt. Set just a little way from the hall is the Church of St Lawrence, and inside are 2 alabaster effigies. The suit of armour is chain mail, so that dates the couple at around the 14th century. The Mannerings of Pever came over with William the Conqueror and held the manor until the 20th century. Tabley House was completed in 1769. The sandstone pillars are cut in one piece, and they had to construct a total of 7 before these 4 were safely installed. This estate has been the home to the Lesters from 1276 to 1954. There's an old Cheshire saying, better to marry over the mixen than over the moor. And one example of many such marriages is Elizabeth Mannering from Pever, who married into the Lester family in 1647. During the Civil War, the celebrated historian Peter Lester was fined and arrested for being a royalist. However, he was allowed to return, and later he was rewarded by Charles II with a baronetcy. Many artists visited Tabley, including Turner, who painted this scene of the castellated tower on the Tabley Mere, with the hall in the background. More atmospheric is his other paintings set in stormy weather. There's a story that while Sir John Fleming Lester was painting a canvas, Turner leant over and added a few strokes of his own. Later, he sent Lester a bill for tuition. Lester was a friend of the Prince Regent, later to become George IV. Now, the Prince had a racehorse called Smoker, and the inn down the road still carries the horse's name. Later, Lester acquired the horse, which is seen here in a different role. The fear of invasion by Napoleon was so strong that troops of part-time yeomanry were formed across the country, and in 1797 Lester was requested to raise such a body in Tabley. This he did, and later became colonel in command of the Cheshire Yeomanry Cavalry. His son is seen here with the yeomanry exercising on Liverpool sands. When the Napoleonic threat had disappeared, the troops were to deal intermittently with the industrial riots, and the yeomanry based at Knutsford were present at the Peterloo massacre in Manchester. There is an island on one of the Tabley Meres where the old hall was built in 1380. It was here until 1927, when it unfortunately collapsed due to subsidence caused by the industrial pumping of brine. Tucked away from the traffic lights at Mere Corner is the old hall at Mere. When the Royalist Meres had to sell up, the parliamentary Brookes bought the estate. In 1765, Sir Peter Brooke married the heiress, Elizabeth Langford of Antigua, an example of an advantageous marriage made over the moor, and the hall was rebuilt with the benefit of the wealth she brought to the marriage. Like the rest of the gentry, the family raised horses, and their favourite, Kilton, gave his name to the inn at Hoo Green. In 1834, Mere New Hall was built across the road, with gatehouse, stables and clock tower. The house was designed in an Elizabethan style, but unfortunately a tragedy was to follow when Peter Langford Brooke was skating on the mere. He fell through the ice and drowned while his wife looked on, and the family then moved back to the old hall. Thomas Edgerton was Lord Keeper to Elizabeth I and Lord Chancellor to James I. He bought the Tatton estate from his half-sister in 1598, and he leased it to a poor relation, John Edgerton, and the Edgertons ruled at Tatton until 1958. By 1750, the family had considerable money problems, and what is now Parkland was a patchwork of tenanted fields, from which the revenue was falling due to a recession in farming. But this didn't stop Samuel Edgerton making plans to enhance the hall, and he ultimately came into an enormous fortune bequeathed by his uncle Samuel Hill. By 1791 the mansion looked like this. The water is not Tatton Mere, but an upper mere from which the water was later drained. Eventually the mansion was transformed to the present design in 1808. By this time the tenant farmers had been encouraged to leave and the hedges were removed. Canals were big business for those who owned them, and Wilbraham Edgerton was chairman of the Manchester Ship Canal Company. In 1887 he cut the first sod with this silver spade. By now the Edgerton's connections went well beyond the county circle and included Gladstone, the Archbishop of Canterbury, ambassadors from France and Italy, and there were royalty who stayed over. Last but not least, Samuel was the local MP, and with the exception of a few years, there was an Edgerton in Parliament until the Liberal landslide of 1906. From the A50 you get this striking view of Toft Hall, with a tall central tower at the end of a double avenue of oak and chestnut. Built in the 17th century, it was given an extensive facelift in 1813, with the help of a comfortable fortune made in India. The Jacobean brickwork was stuccoed and whitened. The Tofts of Toft held the estate until Robert de Toft died in 1462. His daughter Joan had married a Leicester of Tabley, and it was their descendants who became the Leicesters of Toft, and the line has run through to today. From the 13th century to the 19th century, the economy of Knutsford, the market town, was dependent on the surrounding manorial estates. Besides that, all the developments at the manors, which occurred between 1741 and 1813, plus their maintenance and staffing, brought considerable benefit to the townspeople and tradesmen of Knutsford. Race week in Knutsford was an occasion when the showmen came to town and scores of carriages brought people in from over the county. The gentry sponsored the meetings and raced the thoroughbreds from their own stables. As a result, this lively event on the calendar carried considerable prestige. It is not clear when racing started in Knutsford, but the earliest recorded notice of Knutsford races was 1670. The church in the background is artistic license, but that house on the right is the house of Edward Higgins, a gentleman of the road. He came to Knutsford posing as a man with an independent fortune and married into a respectable Knutsford family. He hunted with the gentry in the morning, dined with them in the afternoons, and made himself familiar with their plate chests by night. His household was maintained handsomely by his robberies, and Henry Green devotes 10 pages to his exploits. In the end he was apprehended and sentenced to be hanged from the neck. Even from prison he had the enterprise to organise a forged respite, but this was rumbled and he was hanged at Carmarthen in 1767. Back to the racecourse, and you can see that it takes in most of the land between Manchester Road and Tabley Road. The back straight is down Ladies' Mile on the left-hand side, and it sweeps around Racefield Road, past Gaskell Avenue and along to the stands. A race company took over the event from the county families in the mid-1800s, and they built this rather splendid grandstand. However, times were changing, and by 1862 the new railways brought in riff-raff punters from the cities. The gentry withdrew their support, and the last race was run in 1875. Now in 1821 this poster created great excitement, for it describes in detail how the capital of Mid-Cheshire was going to celebrate the coronation of King George IV on the 19th of July. The procession will meet in the marketplace precisely at 10:30 and proceed through the streets to the racecourse, where the troops will go through the review exercise and fire a feu de joie. Barrels of ale will be distributed to the inhabitants, and school children will be treated to buns and wine. A bonfire on the racecourse will be lighted at precisely 9 o'clock. On Friday there will be a ball at the George Inn. Tickets for the ladies are half price at 3 and 6. The town will be sanded as usual. There's an apocryphal tale that King Canute sat down and shook sand from his shoes just as a bridal procession was passing by. From this coincidence, the ladies of Knutsford would celebrate a marriage by sprinkling coloured sand on their doorsteps and pavements. Favourite among the sanded verses is this one, and there's the old rhyme. Then I asked Nan to wed, and she answered with ease, you may sand for my wedding whenever you please. Although this was not confined to Knutsford, Sanding probably took a hold here because there were no church bells to ring on special occasions until 1749. Following the Catholic Emancipation Act in 1829, the patterns in the sand reflected widespread intolerance in the community. Not a bag of sand could be had for love nor money, and one salt dealer had to use salt to sand his protest. Now, 5 years before she became Queen, Princess Victoria came to King Street in 1832. It's pleasing to find that in her diary she writes about the streets being sanded in shapes, which is peculiar to this town. Nowadays the shapes are seen at their best during the May Day festival. The sandmen are at work by 6 AM and their artistic creations will form a colourful arabesque across the town. The designs are a delight and they help us to identify with those who passed this way before us. Only 20 miles up the road was Manchester. By the 1830s, it had become the benchmark for the Industrial Revolution. From this filthy sewer flowed pure gold. Here humanity attained its most complex development and its most brutish. But the little town of Knutsford continued its tranquil country life, hardly disturbed by national events. To many, including Frederick Engels, a working-class revolution in England was inevitable. And in 1848, he and his co-author Karl Marx launched the Communist Manifesto. That very same year, the novel Mary Barton was published. It was set amongst redundant factory workers at a time when opium dens were commonplace. Whole families took opium to relieve hunger. Many, especially children, died from starvation and lack of shelter. One magazine wrote, "If those who eat 3 meat meals a day are wondering why working men turn Chartists and communists, let them read Mary Barton." This passionate novel was widely praised, but many condemned it as communist propaganda. The controversial author of Mary Barton was Mrs. Elizabeth Gaskell, and she has a special place in the history of Knutsford.
Well, Elizabeth Stevenson was born in Chelsea in 1810, but sadly her mother died a year later, and Elizabeth was brought to Knutsford, where she was to live in this house on the edge of the heath. She was cared for by her mother's sister Hannah, whom she described as more than mother. She would have spent many childhood hours playing happily in its lovely garden, perhaps taking French lessons here, as did one of her fictional characters. The family attended Brook Street Unitarian Chapel, and its gospel of uncensorious hope and charity was to have a strong influence on her outlook. She grew into a lively, good-looking young woman who enjoyed balls and parties, and her engagement to the Reverend William Gaskell came as a surprise to her aunt, who said, "How could this man ever fancy such a giddy, thoughtless little thing as you?" They were married at Knutsford Parish Church, the law at that time forbidding marriage in their own nonconformist chapel. As a minister's wife in Manchester, she came into daily contact with the downtrodden and their grinding poverty. From this first-hand experience, she wrote Mary Barton. Charles Dickens was lavish in his praise, and he persuaded her to become a contributor to his weekly magazine, Household Words. Having already written a sketch of Knutsford society for an American magazine, she rewrote it as fiction for Dickens to publish. He then chivied her to write 7 further instalments. Finally, they were put together in 1853 and published as the novel Cranford. Later, the 1914 edition of Cranford was to contain illustrations of Knutsford. A Knutsford reader in Mrs. Gaskell's day would have been able to identify real characters, including her relations, the Hollands, Captain Hill, and the magician Senior Blitz, as featured in this cutting from the Macclesfield Courier. There was the bizarre incident of the Alderney cow, who got burnt when it fell into the lime pit. They made a large flannel waistcoat for her, so the poor thing could be put out to graze in comfort. The townsfolk came out to watch, and she became an unwitting celebrity. Now, a distinctive feature of the town was that all the holders of houses above a certain rent were women. As Mrs. Gaskell humorously put it, the town was in the possession of the Amazons. If a married couple came to settle in the town, somehow the gentleman disappeared. He was either frightened to death by being the only man at Knutsford's evening parties, or he was with his regiment or his ship, or was closely engaged in business in Manchester. The tone of Knutsford was set by these women, and in Cranford Mrs. Gaskell documented their circle in considerable detail. For instance, they were people of very moderate means, and they practised what was called elegant economy. So if they walked to or from a party, it was because the air was so refreshing, not because sedan chairs were expensive. Should a visitor arrive, they would light a number of candles, but in private they would burn one at a time, constantly lighting one from another to keep them all the same length. Money spending was vulgar and ostentatious. Economy was elegant. Then there was etiquette. Take visiting, for instance. As a caller, you never stayed longer than 15 minutes. Since you mustn't look at your watch, both caller and hostess had this rule in mind, and they kept a small talk. No absorbing subject was ever spoken about. It's no wonder the arrival of the captain caused such dismay. Besides his gender, he would speak openly of his poverty, as if this was not a disgrace. Of all her books, Mrs. Gaskell had a special affection for Cranford. She told Ruskin that Cranford was the only one of her books she could read again and laugh over afresh. The distinguished biography of Charlotte Bronte was written by Mrs. Gaskell, and in all she wrote 6 full-length novels. One of them, Ruth, plunged her into more controversy. Members of William's congregation shunned her because the book dealt with the unmentionable topics of an unmarried mother and illegitimacy. Her novel North and South was socio-political, and she was acknowledged as having a profound understanding of the nature of social change in the 19th century. Charles Dickens had a great regard for her, but her independence of mind so infuriated him that he said if he were her husband, how he would beat her. Her last novel, Wives and Daughters, has greater Knutsford interest than Cranford. Many Knutsford people and buildings figure in Wives and Daughters, and Tutton Park completes the setting. She died unexpectedly in 1865 and was buried alongside her ancestors in the graveyard of Brook Street Chapel. Later, William and 2 of her daughters were buried here with her. During Elizabeth Gaskell's very full life, she gave birth to 7 children, 3 of whom died in infancy. Indeed, the death of her 10-month-old son was to spur her into writing Mary Barton. Today her works are studied in universities from Europe across America to Japan, and she put Knutsford on the map.
Before we join Knutsford's May Day, we're going to take a brief interlude with some 19th century scenes familiar to Mrs. Gaskell and their present-day setting. Spring, spring, the sweet spring is the year's pleasant thing. Then blooms each thing, then maids dance in a ring. Before the calendar was changed in 1752, May Day or Lay Day fell on what is now May the 12th, and that was when Knutsford's cattle were put out to pasture. The maypole and the festival of May can be traced back to Celtic times, but many Puritan minds, including Cromwell, saw the maypole as the focus of a heathen vanity. At Rosthern in 1661, the vicar, Adam Martindale, preached against the profanation, and his wife, with 3 young women, whipped it down in the night with a framing saw. Today, Knutsford's Festival of May will entertain the streets with a coronation procession, led as is customary by the Marshal. The veteran Mr. Nichols led the procession for nearly 30 years. In 1896, they all stood motionless, including the horse, for this classic photograph, which was taken on a long exposure film. Knutsford's May Day, as we know it today, was put together in 1864 by the secretary of the Grandstand Company and the daughters of the Reverend Clews. Prior to that, it had been a very simple affair. At the bottom of Adams Hill stands the old parochial school, and the boys were marched from here to the girls' school on Tatton Street for the purpose of choosing a May Queen. The Electoral College turned its mind to the attractive resident at the Lord Eldon Public House, and so it was that Anne Pollitt, the daughter of the landlord and his wife, was conferred as the Queen of May. The organisers made a conscious effort to give the festival a rural feel, which today is best captured by the drays. So as well as milkmaids and cowmen, the characters included 2 milk cows adorned with flower garlands. The shepherdesses knew how to play to the gallery, and they brought along a pet lamb. A delightful feature in the event was the village wedding, as it has been through all the years that followed. One of the earliest photographs is this one, with its bo-peep bridesmaids, top hat and mortarboard. Knutsford's first May Day was Monday the 2nd of May, and throughout the town the day was observed as a general holiday. It was reported that in the northwest that everyone wore a badge of brightness, but to see a worthy celebration of the May of England, you had to take the train for Knutsford. There are 3 bands today, but in 1864 the procession marched to the band of the 15th Cheshire Rifle Volunteers, and 1,000 children from all the schools in Crosstown, Knutsford and the workhouse formed a procession a quarter of a mile long. As a treat, the school children had plum cake in abundance and rustic sports, various in description and harmless in character. By now, Knutsford was on the rail network, and without distinction to class, pleasure seekers streamed to secure a carriage seat. They came from the industrial towns of Northwich, Stockport, Warrington and Manchester. Over 1,000 came from Northwich alone. Among the characters were representatives of the trades, often playing the roles of their parents, such as the sweep with his brushes, the barber carrying a wig, sadly not here today, foot soldiers and horse soldiers, and a sailor who in 1869 was armed with a cutlass. The earliest programme we can find is that of 1873. There's a list of all the schools taking part, and the band of the 15th Volunteers had been augmented by the Altrincham Temperance Band. By now the troublesome blades from Sherwood Forest had turned up, namely Robin Hood, Friar Tuck, Maid Marian and Will Scarlet. However, not everything was sweetness and light. In 1875, Crosstown held its own May Day because no May Queen had ever been chosen from Crosstown, and the procession had not walked past the Lee Arms and the Crosstown Triangle for the past 2 years. So 200 children made the procession to Booth's Hall, where they crowned their own queen on the same day as Knutsford's May Day. The same year had something completely unforeseen. A long excursion train pulled in, and the end of the train did not reach the platform. Consequently, the eager passengers could see the procession passing beneath them. The embankment, which you could see, was not walled at that time, and without regard to bramble, nettles, hawthorn and other trees, they poured down in a torrent with lengthy and dangerous leaps upon the assembled crowd beneath. Worse was to follow. A temporary stand collapsed on the heath, throwing 200 people into a heap. Mrs. Wrigley claimed £245 worth of damages against the vicar, who was chairman of the committee. Special care was needed to regain popularity, so in 1878 the Godley Hill Morris dancers were generously paid to perform at Knutsford. They were an immediate success, and such is their popularity that there are 6 teams of Morris dancers in this year's parade. Nursery rhymes have always provided good characters, and by 1895 there was the old woman who lived in a shoe, Red Riding Hood, Jack and Jill and Bo Peep. King and country were represented by Britannia and John Bull, and this being Knutsford, it was most important to ensure that the wisdom of King Canute was not forgotten. A court must have a jester or two, and they were frequently reported for creating consternation and amusement by the vigour with which they laid about them with their sticks and bladders. Children of different nations formed a comprehensive spectrum, including China, Italy, Africa, America, Wales, Scotland and Ireland. Today this is extended to a total of 22. There's always been a place for new ideas, and today this is most apparent on the floats, where the themes change every year. Earlier this century, the horse-drawn wagons were known in agricultural circles as lurries with a U. Nowadays they're lorries with an O. There's not many people know that. In 1887, this poster proclaimed Knutsford's May Day set for Jubilee Day, June the 21st. However, at the beginning of May, the Prince and Princess of Wales came to Manchester to open the Jubilee exhibition. They stayed 2 nights at Tatton as the guests of Lord Egerton, and a mini version of the May Day was arranged for them on May the 2nd. The London Illustrated News carried this picture of the Prince and Princess of Wales coming up King Street, which had to be sanded twice because of the rain. Nearest to us on the right is the premises now occupied by Boots, and next to it stands the Rose and Crown. Mary Howarth was the May Queen, and she held court with her retinue outside the town hall. When the visitors arrived, Mary presented Princess Alexandra with namesake orchids, Odontoglossum alexandra. Then followed a most important incident. Lord Egerton had a whispered conversation with Mr. Nichols, who whispers something in turn to some of the committee, who rather surprisingly lift their hats and cheer. No wonder they looked so pleased. His Royal Highness had conferred the title of Royal May Day Festival. Over a century later, the majority of costumes have been preserved in good order, a magnificent record achieved by the diligent work of the May Day committees. Children were smaller in those days, and in many cases the costumes have been retailored. In 1864, the rustic element extended to a very rustic chariot for the royal personage, but today a handsome landau carries the Queen to the crowning ceremony. In addition to the Queen's conveyance, there are landaus carrying the occupants in a manner fitting to the ladies of court and maids-in-waiting. Reflecting their status on this occasion, the Lord Chamberlain and the Judge, the heralds, the royal falconer, sword-bearer, sceptre-bearer and crown-bearer have arrived by Shanks's pony. The Morris dancers, the lorries and the 400 characters have arrived, and the crowds have weaved and jostled their way onto the heath. Finally, the entourage of court. To the strains of the gavotte played by the Knutsford Brass Band, they progress to the dais with the traditional slow march. In 1998, Laura Foster will be the 124th May Queen to be crowned since Anne Pollitt in 1864. May sunshine greet the Queen of May, and mirth and gladness crown the day. The entertainment at the court includes a festival of modern and traditional dance, sailor's hornpipe and a Highland sword dance. Bringing the festival to a finale is the maypole dance. Today, the pizzazz of the fair has replaced the plum cake and rustic sports harmless in character. But the tradition of the May Day festival lives on. Thrice welcome, darling of the spring.
First thing we saw at the top of the town was a building so grand, so high in renown, that a lord might live there, but one hardly believes that such a fine place was built only for thieves. This witty little stanza from the Countryman's Ramble described the Sessions House, which was completed in 1818. The elegant facade matches the splendour of Tatton, which gave an importance and satisfaction to the town. But the absence of windows hinted at the grim reality of the county jail which was built behind it. At this time, Knutsford shared the judicial responsibilities of the county with Chester. Knutsford was ideal because it had a central location, and there was the role of the gentry. Acting as justices of the peace, they ran the local civic and legal administration, for which they were unpaid and untrained. At the back was the prison, known as the House of Correction. It had 4 radiating wings, 3 for men and 1 for women. A high wall enclosed the whole site. The diet for a well-behaved prisoner was a punishment in itself. If they grumbled, they got no bread for a day. In the case of troublesome prisoners, the governor believed in methods of coercion. Whether they corrected or not was another matter. A number of Chartists were brought to Knutsford not as felons but as misdemeanants, and they complained that, contrary to all custom, they were taken to work the treadmill for the amusement of several ladies and gentlemen who were anxious for the sport. The Secretary of State sent in a prison inspector who produced a damning report of the governor's methods, and 5 new visiting magistrates were appointed. However, the governor, whose house stands on the corner, stayed on. His superior discipline was approved by his local employers. The prison was closed before the First World War, and during the war, conscientious objectors were interned here. Afterwards, it was turned into an ordination training centre, with the parish church acting as its chapel. The men were from the armed forces, and while they were here, they took part in Knutsford May Day. The scheme was devised by Tubby Clayton, the founder of Toc H, and he presented this lectern to the parish church. It was made from brass shell cases and brought from the original Tockage Chapel at Popperinge in Flanders. Just down Stanley Road from the prison, the dreaded system of poor relief was operated by the Poor Law Institute, generally known as the Workhouse, which stood on what is now a car park. The vagrants who stayed here were given work in return for a night's lodging. However, the conditions were so bad they would sometimes refuse to do the work and consequently earn a prison sentence with its superior food and accommodation. After the Second World War, Cranford Lodge Hospital took over the buildings, but the stigma of the workhouse was still difficult to shake off. Opposite the Sessions House and on the corner of the churchyard is a turnpike milepost slowly being covered by layers of tarmac. There is another on the Northwich Road, and sometimes people mistakenly think it's a signpost the wrong way round. They were part of the toll road system, which was introduced from the mid-16th century because the parishes could not be relied upon to maintain the King's Highway. There would be a toll house for the collection of the toll and the operation of the turnpike. This is the one on Northwich Road, and travelling south on the A50 you will see this one adjacent to the Whipping Stocks Inn. In 1872 the Market Hall was opened. It was built by William Tatton and designed in the Victorian Gothic by Alfred Waterhouse. The E is for Edgerton, and the bevel bricks around the window are locally made Edgerton bricks. The ground floor with its open arches was a marketplace, and the first floor was a hall for meetings and concerts. This notice of a public meeting concerned the issue of free church pews. The Edgertons were happy to change, but others were not so keen, and it took dry rot to settle the matter in favour of free seats. That recording was made by one of the surviving trumpeters of the Light Brigade, and in the churchyard is a memorial to another surviving trumpeter, William Smith, whose horse was shot from under him. He survived the ordeal and became a trumpet major by the time he sat for this portrait. In Knutsford he was a popular character who sang at concerts and on such occasions as the laying of the foundation stone of the new grandstand on Knutsford Heath. Sadly, he took leave of the world on laudanum and alcohol. We don't know where he was buried, but in 1991 John Lester organised this new gravestone from the War Graves Commission to be erected to his memory. Today it's difficult for us to credit the patriotism of former times, and Daniel Leach, no relation, gives us some indication. He had a penchant for patriotism and Cheshire ale, and after the sermon he would sometimes feel the need to give a fortissimo rendition of the old national anthem. Clearly he was a mixed blessing, for he went to great effort and expense to establish the church organ. Even so, the vicar made it clear he was happy to bury him. In 1893, Wilbraham and Edgerton built this new school for Knutsford. As was the custom of the day, boys and girls were strictly segregated. The design of the school can clearly be seen on this certificate, which also contains the letter of thanks to Lord Edgerton for saving the ratepayers a heavy and continuous burden. Until 1944, children entered the school at the age of 7 and went into the world of work at 14. During this time, the Nether Knutsford Education Foundation provided a scholarship place for one boy and one girl. In 1926, the girl was Amy E. Cruise.
We girls caught the train to Northwich and walked over a mile to St John Dean's Grammar School. I didn't like the ICI influence, but overall I enjoyed my life at St John Dean's.
After the new secondary school was built, the Edgerton School became the local primary school until 1973. The Gents Outfitters on King Street has a surprise in store. For inside, the construction is revealed to be one of the Knutsford's buildings made of wattle and daub. The stakes are wattle, and the daub infill could be lime, mud or dung with chopped straw. At one time, this row was a single house, allegedly owned by a Dowager Lee of Booths, and until recently there was a floor-to-ceiling fireplace with the Lee's crest which lent support to that belief. The pavement in Knutsford's main street was narrow by design. Lady Jane Stanley, sister of the racing Earl of Derby, disliked linking, that is, men and women walking arm in arm. So in her donation for the pavement of the town, she insisted that a single flag in breadth was to be the limit of her generosity. However, she didn't specify the breadth, and her wishes were often evaded. Just down from King Street, in the centre of the screen, you can see the old bakehouse. This is where the poor used to leave their Sunday dinner to be roasted. In Cranford, Captain Brown helped an old lady on a slippery Sunday to carry home her baked mutton and potatoes. And for this eccentricity, he was expected to explain and apologise to the Cranford sense of propriety. Now this isn't a traffic jam in King Street, but a queue of Watson's delivery vans waiting to load up. This was a busy corner, for Watson's was the Fortnum and Mason of Knutsford. As you enter the door, you are greeted with the delicious smell of roasting coffee, and the mosaic floor announced a business of substance. They made their own bread on the premises, which extended back round into Church Hill. 3 businesses are now trading from the building, but the old hoist recalls the nostalgia of another age. Walking down King Street, the street narrows as you come to the Tudor cottages. The thatch roofs were replaced by wooden shingles after a fire in 1938, but it's a shame that we don't know more about their early history. Beyond them, the chocolate shop on the other side of the road is the house of Captain Brown in Cranford. In real life, he was Captain Hill, a Waterloo veteran, to whom the Edgertons let the house at a peppercorn rent. We have recounted how he was the butt of their pettiness and snobbery, but they came to appreciate his kindness of heart and the resourcefulness gained by his time in the army. At the junction of King Street with Adams Hill were some old cottages and a pump, which had to be swept away when the railway arrived. The railways were a great source of employment, and the curtailed verandas were the stamp of stations up and down the land. With their ornamental gussets, they are still here today, and so too is the road bridge over the tracks. Its design causes some wonderment, because until 1973 it carried a metal notice plate warning that it should only carry traffic normal for the time it was built. Constructed 120 feet wide, it now carries 4 lanes of traffic, as well as 2 pavements and a traffic island. Other towns had paid and prayed for railways, but Knutsford said hands off, or rather rails off, and would not touch the unclean thing. In 1862 it was opened with no ostentation and very little ceremony. The rail network attracted tourists who were preferred to industrialisation, and as we shall see, it was instrumental in bringing a unique architecture to the town.
This could be a holiday slide slipped in by mistake. In fact, it is an Italian campanella, and it raises the headline question, what's what in Knutsford? In 1895, John Henry Brooke designed a mansion in Lee Road for a Manchester glove merchant, Richard Harding Watt. It was reviewed in the builder, and there was nothing in the croft to indicate what impact the new resident would have on Knutsford. He had trained as an art teacher, and this sketch of Heathwaite in Gaskell Avenue is probably his most popular sketch. Testimony to his drafting skills is his diary compiled on his journey from Australia to England in 1864. He was 22 at the time, and the detail of his tiny sketches are quite amazing, considering that the page is only 3 inches wide by 4.5 inches high. In 1898, John Long's tannery in Drury Lane came on the market. Watt stepped in and bought it. In its place, he imagined a fantastic skyline of quite unrelated buildings recorded in his travels. He took his architect Fairhurst to Italy to make notes and sketches, and they put together this development based on a laundry. The chimney was enclosed in a minaret, and the water tower was a replica of a tower he had seen in Damascus. On his own tower, he fixed a quotation from Ezekiel in green tiles, "Let your garments be always white." This is another sketch viewed from the moor. The moss-like domes were boiler houses, and further up the hill, beyond the drying rooms, he built cottages with verandas for his employees. The buildings are still here, but the chimneys, boiler houses and water tower, which made the skyline, have been removed because they became structurally unsafe. In Nearby, Watt built Cranford Gardens for my grandfather, who needed to move out of Manchester for his daughter's health. Watt and Howard regularly toured Italy together on business. Howard did the business buying leather and gloves. Watt made sketches and collected statues, ornamental railings and fountains for Knutsford. At the top of Drury Lane, he built the library and recreation rooms for his workers. From King Street, you were greeted with an ostensibly Mediterranean vision of pan-tile roofs, arched windows, little green domed cupola and ornamental chimneys. There were ledges and recesses designed for the birds. Latter-day occupants have taken a diametrically opposite approach. The second floor was for reading and musical evenings financed by the laundry. On the first floor was a flat for the caretaker, and below there was stabling and a coal house for the laundry. Now, central to this socially based architecture was Watt's belief in the arts and crafts movement, which was not identified by a style but by a set of attitudes. On the one hand, it was a reaction to the dehumanization experienced in the Industrial Revolution. People in the workplace should have dignity and satisfaction. On the other hand, the restrictions of classical forms were rejected in favour of social function. The movement was led by William Morris, but the author John Ruskin was its formative inspiration, and it is therefore no surprise that Watt named the building the Ruskin Recreation Rooms. Coming into Knutsford by train, you were struck by the exotic scene on the far side of the moor. Seldom had something as prosaic as a laundry achieved such an astonishing profile. The train had opened up Knutsford to self-made men from Manchester, and a name they were not going to forget was Richard Harding Watt. Meanwhile, on the slopes that overlooked Mollypots Moor, he had been busy in Lee Road, and Italian-style houses had begun to appear. This one is a close match to a house in Florence. He applied the same kind of render to the exterior facades and finished them off with a colour wash. In Italy, the plaster falls off with age and reveals the brickwork. In Lee Road, Watt imported the effect and revealed the stonework by design. The roofs, pan-tiled and low-pitched, are characteristically Mediterranean. On the lower floors, the windows are high and vertical, while above, the windows are small and tucked under the eaves. Many of the windows are trimmed with stone or raised render, and he included classical features such as pediments, columns and balustrades, which he had picked up cheaply from the demolition contractors in Manchester. Some of the lines are extremely dramatic, and it is difficult to believe that Clough Williams-Ellis was not influenced by Watt when he designed his Italianate village of Portmeirion some 30 years later. Surprisingly, Watt wasn't good at technical drawings, and he used to get his architects to build models, and he would mark recessed bricks in red and projecting bricks in blue. He disliked formal plans, and he stormed round the sites like a maniac, inventing, changing and discarding ideas from day to day. Parts of the classical buildings demolished in Manchester, together with the ironware and stonework collected from abroad, were brought to Knutsford. Imagine all these pieces scattered in confusion over a wide area here, and as Fairhurst brought the chaos under control, so Watt was creating new chaos. There was further chaos over Watt's chimneys. Their artistic design didn't encourage the smoke to flow upwards, and Fairhurst was sent to see the irate owners. When Fairhurst reported back with a solution, Watt would grumble that he couldn't afford it, and left Fairhurst to face the music. Poor Fairhurst, after 3 years, he quit what had been a very productive partnership. Watt, however, was unstoppable, and his designs included the generative forms of Art Nouveau, the very latest art style. He needed skilled craftsmen for this kind of work, but he also employed craftsmen to build the functional items, like floors and fireplaces, in the best tradition of the arts and crafts movement. He employed craftsmen to make fittings, such as window latches, and the costs were far beyond the reach of anyone but the rich. On this account, the tenets of the movement were seriously open to question. But Watt was his own man and held his own tenets, and when the Royal Infirmary in Manchester was demolished, he took a fancy to the lodge and reassembled it in Lee Road, however non-functional the classic design might be. Watt liked to name each house, and he called this one the Round House. A bit of a tease until you view it from the back. He also liked the idea of a folly here and there. In this instance, he's built a pineapple for a summer house, and that which resembles a bandstand auditorium was designed as a dovecote. Behind his own house, the Croft, there is half a watt. He redesigned the upper floor and turned it into 2 cottages. Watt was a peppery sort of person with a reputation for firing people. His chauffeur lived in one half of the house, and he used to carry around a preemptive letter of resignation in his pocket. In the other half lived the technician. Among other things, he was responsible for maintaining the electric generator in the back garden, and for the snakes and lizards in Watt's reptile house. Behind the houses in Lee Road is Mollypots Moor, where the River Lily rises. The trees and plants grow in the water, and here he created a bird sanctuary. He also created water gardens by experimenting with the flow of the Lily, and at night the gardens of Lee Road were lit by electric light powered by the generator. Watt was 57 when he started the laundry, and 6 years later he married Mary Armitage, who was 43. You see, Watt was disapproved of by her father, and they couldn't marry until he died. Watt's temper may have been mercurial, but he was regarded as a kind and generous man. In addition to his other activities, he was chairman of the Housing of the Working Class Committee. Of the 616 houses they visited, only 69 had water closets, and 201 were without proper water supply. His report pulled no punches, and the remedial conclusions were adopted by the Urban District Council. Watt's last building sums up his astonishing contribution: a coffee house with a serious social purpose, a non-profit making club and intellectual centre for the whole town. There was a large oven so that freshly baked bread and cakes should be available to the workers, and at any hour a warm bath could be had for 6p. The first floor was ideal for debates, musical evenings, exhibitions, and here the Knutsford artisans were welcome to spend an evening with pleasure and profit without spending more than they liked. Watt was liberal in his attitudes and politics, so to run the enterprise he employed 2 sisters, the Miss Wilsons, who were ideally qualified for his purpose. These are some of their paintings, but over and above their artistic leanings they moved in literary circles. What's more, they were in the suffragette movement, and one of them went to jail for her feminist activities. On the land adjacent to the coffee house he wanted to build a post office, fronted by 2 massive columns. The council were indifferent, so he extended the coffee house. He called it the King's Coffee House because it stood in King Street. It also gave him the excuse to engrave the line of English kings from Egbert to Edward VII on the leading pillar. Should you be confused between the Saxons and the Normans, then you can just stand here and sort it all out. Entering the coffee house, you find a floor of marble mosaic laid by the Italians who Watt brought over to do the work and to give instruction to local people. It wouldn't be Watt if he didn't leave an inscription. There's not a lot of elbow room in King Street, but outside he chose to open at the site with a courtyard and started building upwards with the help of the 2 columns he had planned for the post office. The columns were from the demolished church of St. Peter in Manchester, and on the roof garden are the carriage wheels that trundle the columns to Knutsford. Here you could dine al fresco, weather permitting. Watt hoped that coffee might prove an attractive alternative to alcohol, but in the event, the artisans of Knutsford stuck to their knitting or their pints in the pub, and the coffee house became a comfortable middle-class hotel. Just the place for John Hall of the Manchester Guardian, who ultimately married one of the Wilsons. Down on the moor at Swinton Square, he had renovated a row of workers' cottages, and on the end he built a cottage of his own style to define this corner of the moor. He planned the moor itself as a wondrous garden with a lake, a tree-studded island and an ornamental bridge. The view from the train was such that with the laundry in the background and Swinton Square in the foreground, the eye was drawn from the edge of the moor into the bowl of the town. Here was his crowning glory, a slender white tower adjoining the coffee house, dedicated to Mrs. Gaskell. The 3 copper bells are no longer here, but in 1907 they were rung at the opening ceremony. Watt's latest creation was not universally approved of in Knutsford, and the chairman of the council said he had not known it was going to be a tower. In his address, Watt declared that he felt on his defence. He hoped people would forgive and forget. He had no wish to monopolise the honour of paying homage to Mrs. Gaskell, but he found the best and most unanimous committee was a committee of 1. Only as big a dreamer as Watt could have conceived such schemes, and only as hard-headed a businessman could make them work. Watt fervently believed that architecture should stimulate the mind and inspire the spirit, and he seemed to live by the quotation which he had engraved on the front wall of the Ruskin Rooms. "Let every dawn of morning be to you as the beginning of life, and every setting sun be to you as the close." There's a calmness in the green field with its white fencing, and beyond, the elements of pastoral life look on, or not as the case may be. Pray for a sunny day, picnic hampers beneath the spread of the horse chestnuts, and a breeze when toff to fielding. From time to time there's the sound of leather on willow, and it's going to take all day. Taverners by tradition, there's something quintessentially English in a rural game which all started in the little Hampshire village of Hambledon. The origins of Toft's village cricket are not on record, but they must predate the ball presented to Benny Warnes 100 years ago, a club for the farming community of Toft and Bexton. The village school was the committee room, the tea room and the pavilion, and to the right the cricket pitch sat cosily between the Roebuck Inn on one boundary, the old vicarage on another, and on the fourth was a spectacular oak with a view of the Welsh hills beyond it. An idyllic spot until the tenant farmer put it under the plough in 1938. So Toft's cricketers made their way down Goff's Lane and past the boundary stone to accept A.W. Coburn's hospitality on the Booths Hall estate. For the next 50 years they were to play other village teams like Davenham, Highley, Ashley and Ollerton. There was also the little matter of a national competition. Toft had reached the final in 1978 and come off second best. Now in 1989 they were going to Lords again, and their opponents this time were from Hambledon. Hambledon, where it all began. It was a sports writer's dream. Cricket was coming home, and the headlines were crafted well before the game had got underway. Hambledon batted first and got to 72 for 5, but then the weather took charge and washed the game away. It would have to be replayed at Beckenham in Kent the following day. Starting again and batting first, Hambledon reached a total of 104. The pressure was now on Toft, and with only 5 runs on the board, they had lost 2 wickets. The chairman can't disguise his concern, and there's anxiety and sweat in the changing room. It's often like that, but today it is unbearable, and the target looks gargantuan. Slowly, the Toft score creeps up, until with only 3 overs left, they passed the 104. So much had been expected from Hambledon, and on account of it, the pressure on Toft was significantly reduced. The headlines were thrown in the bin, and the reports consigned to a couple of column inches on the inside page. Toft had become one of the biggest party poopers in cricketing history, and all of a sudden, on Toft's ancient coat of arms, people could discern a smile on the face of the Roebuck. Today, the ground and clubhouse stand as they did in 1938, except for the removal of the famous oak which grew on the wrong side of the playing boundary. The roots of the club are now firmly based, not in Toft, but in Knutsford, as the largest part of the club is the junior section with 125 members. The coaches aim to provide a framework of encouragement where skills can be advanced and the juniors can enjoy the game. By 1916, the world order had changed, and the collapse of farm prices worldwide heralded the breakup of the manorial estates. The Lees sold Booths Hall to the Coburns, and the rest of the estate was sold off to different buyers. With one exception, it's a similar story with the other manorial estates. Now, by one of those odd quirks of history, Knutsford of all places formed an association with nuclear physics. This is a team who successfully tendered for the design of Bradwell Nuclear Power Station in 1956. They were working for NPPC, who had taken the lease on Booths Hall because it was in easy reach of the Atomic Energy Authority at Risley. What's more, at Radbrook Hall, another design team from AEI John Thompson were working on Berkeley Nuclear Power Station. The technology was still classified secret, and a member of another team was disconcerted to find himself sharing digs with the secretary of the local Communist Party. In King Street, you could hear technocrats talking of reactivity and graphite bricks, Perhaps they were going to build something on the moor or the heath. The euphoria of electricity from the atom was short-lived, and by 1960 the national budget was cut and the industry was forced into contraction. The two companies merged to form TMPG, and Radbrook Hall, which had been built in 1917, became the main office. Booth's Hall became home to specialist teams. There were 5 nuclear design companies in the late 50s, but by 1980 there was just the one, NNC. In 1981, NNC bought Booth's Hall and allowed continued use of the land by the Farm and Toft Cricket Club. By 1998, nuclear power is less than half of NNC's business, and the industry waits to see if its green card will get the green light. At Pever Hall, the whole estate was sold in 1919 to a cotton merchant, John Peel, and in 1940 he sold it on to Harry Brooks. He was a Manchester furniture tycoon, and his family have lived here ever since. During the Second World War, the main hall became the headquarters of General Patton of the American Third Army before the invasion of France. He found the Georgian Hall drafty, and it seems he preferred the time that he spent in the pub and the church. He was asked to present the church with an American flag as a memento. After the initial shock of being asked to give away the Stars and Stripes, he eventually gave his consent. The Georgian Hall was demolished in 1964, and a lot of care has gone into restoring the old hall, which is open to the public once a week. At Toft, the family still runs the estate, but the hall was sold off in 1977. The interior had to be extensively renovated to become business accommodation. Since then, the elegance of the hall has been enjoyed by many, including software writers and healthcare administrative staff. The Lester family lived at Tabley until John Lester Warren died in 1975. The house was then acquired by Manchester University, who on the first floor preserve a collection of furnishing and paintings assembled by the Lester family. It's open to the public, so you can wander into the splendour of another era and another way of living, which at that time set man-traps in the lake to deter poachers. The considerable stables have been converted into apartments, and the ground floor of the hall is now a residential care home. The old hall at Mere remained home to Mrs. Langford Brooke until she passed away in 1995. Now the hall is going to be converted into apartments. The new hall at Mere was sold as a golf and country club after the family moved back into the old hall in 1914. The course was laid out by 2 Open champions, James Braid and George Duncan, and incidentally it's a very good test of golf. The facilities at the country club have extended to health and fitness, and in this part of the club alone there are over 1,000 members. At Tatton, Maurice Edgerton was famous for his Benz motor car and its registration number plate M1. M is for Cheshire, and the 1 signifies it is the first to be registered. Known affectionately as Lordy, he was also famous for catching 2 tunnyfish on the same line off the coast at Scarborough. Visitors to the main hall can see them in the showcase on the ground floor. This is Maurice with children from Manchester who have come to Tatton for a day out. To the surprise of Knutsfordians, many came barefoot, and Lordy would ensure the local cobbler fitted them before they went home. He died a bachelor, and the hall was bequeathed to the National Trust, who now contract Cheshire County Council to administer and maintain it. The tenant farms and much of the rest of the estate was purchased by the Overpever estate. Much to everyone's consternation, it included Knutsford Heath. The legal inquiry of 1973 confirmed the new ownership, but it also confirmed that Knutsford Heath was indeed common land. So as long as the freeholders continue to exercise their rights of common, the heath will be protected from any changes in the near future. Back at Tatton, the Education Department organises living history events, and at the Old Hall they stage an experience of medieval conditions. The Old Hall was constructed as a great hall. There is no chimney, and the smoke from the fire just rises up into the high roof. The roof was windbraced with quatrefoils, and it is thought to predate Tudor times. Down at floor level, they have an interesting artefact. It's a curfew. The name, by the way, is Franglaise, meaning cover the fire. Over in the barn, they're threshing the wheat. The flail has a flying swingle, so you must throw it with skill or take a bang on the ear. The scene over at the old hall looks typically medieval. They are making corn dollies with wheat stalks. After the wheat has been threshed, then the grain is separated out in the wind by winnowing the wheat from the chaff. These events are popular with schools and takes history into an accessible realm. There are several herds of deer at Tatton, and during the war, this area of parkland was the dropping zone for No. 1 Parachute Training School, Ringway. Many thousands trained here, and on the high ground at the back is a memorial to their service in every theatre of war. Within living memory, the park at Tatton has always been an amenity to Knutsfordians. Nowadays, anyone can saunter in and enjoy the surroundings. As you can imagine, the stables at Tatton are fit for a king, and as you walk past, you find yourself at the entrance to Tatton Gardens. The old vegetable garden was sheltered by this wall, which contained a network of chimneys, and those jardiniers on top are chimney pots. Apricot and peach trees grew against the wall, and to prevent the frost nipping the buds, the gardeners lit fires from the garden refuse, and the chimneys conducted the heat to the walls. Before the war, there were 20 gardeners. The work was labour-intensive. The paths, for instance, were kept meticulously free of weeds without weed killer. Each gardener had a boy working with him, and the boys who came from outside the district lived here in the bothy. Tatton is a spring garden, if you can call 50 acres a garden, but there again it was on a scale to entertain the Victorian society invited by the Edgertons. Banks on banks of rhododendrons flood the eye with colour, ranging from the purest white through into pinks and the deepest reds. Now the weight of a double-headed tree will cause it to split at the trunk, and the time-honoured remedy was to graft a spar between the trunks. This beech has stood the test of time, but unfortunately more than one creature has started to undermine its integrity by building a home in it. The triffid-like creatures are gunnera in springtime. In summer they grow to over 7 feet in height. During the winter, the gardeners cover the crowns with the old leaves, and the huge stalks are laid on top. If this was a golf course, I'd say it was Augusta. It goes without saying that a Tatton spring is radiant with azaleas. They are so dense on the banks of the ornamental lake that it can be difficult to see their glory from the footpaths. Novelty was important and authenticity was important, so in 1910 they brought gardeners from Japan to landscape a garden with Japanese features. There is a hand bowl at each of the 3 entrances to the garden, and there has to be a thatched tea room. It stands on a tiny island where the waters stream past it from west to east. The Shinto temple was transported from Japan and erected on an island to complement the garden. To the very left is an old stove house, converted to form a show house of exotic and colourful plants. The birds of paradise are an early show, and in the summer the show changes by the month. By late summer, shy and retiring abutilon peer down on confident chrysanthemum. The greenhouse fernery was designed by Joseph Paxton around 1850, and stocked with grasses and New Zealand tree ferns collected by Charles Egerton during his time in the Navy. When the trees grow too tall for the greenhouse, they lop off the top third, take away the bottom of the tree, which they replace with the head. It is then sheathed in sphagnum moss to contain the moisture. Formal Italian gardens were popular in the 17th century, and they became fashionable again in Victorian times. Today the colours are the pink and blue of the National Trust. The stunning pink is Dahlia, Princess Mary Jo's, and the hues of complementary blue are worn by lavender, heliotrope and catmint. In the run-up to the general election in 1997, there had been a growing disquiet in the country at large. There was something rotten in the Palace of Westminster, and perhaps they were all at it. Sir Gordon Downey was investigating allegations against 11 MPs who were standing for re-election, including the sitting member for Tatton. For a number of reasons, the press had concentrated on the member for Tatton, who had a fiercely loyal wife and a massive majority. To focus the national issue, the Labour and Liberal candidates in Tatton withdrew in favour of an independent candidate, Martin Bell, the BBC war correspondent who had been injured while reporting in Bosnia. He had a reputation for objectivity in reporting. He was standing for decency in public office, and his white suit was good for some lighter moments as well as for its obvious symbolism. The town was back on the map. Mr Hamilton's campaign headquarters was in Knute Square, and Mr Bell's HQ was a hotel opposite the Heath. Just one man and a telephone operating from the basement. Later his daughter Melissa left her job to run the party machine from the top street, something they all cheerfully regarded as a contraption rather than a machine. Mr Bell's first press conference, arranged on Knutsford Heath, was a baptism of fire. Mr and Mrs Hamilton staged a confrontation as he tried to make his way towards the press corps. It was duly reported as the Battle of the Heath. The result, 1-0 to Mr Hamilton. On May the 1st, all the MPs under investigation by Sir Gordon Downey lost their seats. For the first time since 1951, when the joint universities returned AP Herbert, an independent MP was going to Westminster, the member for Tatton.
Martin, you've been in the job now for 18 months. What's it like to be an independent MP?
It's a great privilege to be any kind of MP. Difficult to be an independent to start off with because you've got no one immediate to advise you. But it's great because you can vote as you want. Huge privilege to sit in those green seats. Difficult to get acquainted with the voting system. But the best part of it actually is the constituency part, helping people, trying to help people. And when people down south ask me what it's like up here, I tell them it's like Surrey but with real people.
Martin, do you have any sympathy for Mr Hamilton?
I do have a certain sympathy with him. Of course, I was the instrument of his unseating from Parliament, but it was the people of Tatton who did that. But after that, he found it extraordinarily difficult to earn a living because of the way that the House of Commons disciplinary procedures treated him, and I don't think they treated him well in the end. So yes, I do have a certain sympathy.
What progress would you like to see in the lifetime of this Parliament?
I would like this Parliament to be an instrument of the country being well governed. I would like to see some constitutional reform. Most of all, I would like to help the people here. I'm never going to make political history, although we shook it up a little bit in the election in '97. But I would like, when the history comes to be written, to be remembered somewhere in its footnotes as one who made a difference.
Thank you, Martin.
There was a time when you came to Knutsford with top hat and pig, but surprisingly there was no marketplace for livestock. As well as Knute Square, they used the yards of the inns, such as the Red Cow, formerly the Brown Cow, and if things got too crowded, they spilled onto Knutsford Heath. Livestock arrived on the hoof, but once it could be transported by lorry, Knutsford's market disappeared to Chelford, adjoining the railway, and Knute Square became part of the A50. In the modern world of Mrs. Gaskell, Knutsford was quaint and old-fashioned, but she was clear that a remedy for the harrowing scenes in Manchester could not be found in a flight to the simpler, caring society of Cranford. The 1881 census shows nearly 300 different occupations, many of which we have forgotten, such as silk weaver, black pudding maker, gunsmith, street organ player, but the biggest employment was found in domestic service and labouring. As late as the 50s, many casual farm labourers lived in the barns, and on payday they headed for a good time, as Don Blake recalls from his childhood.
Friday nights, when the labourers used to come down, and there used to be fights outside the Red Cow, and that carried on for quite a long while. Yeah. But later on I can remember two youths, they were farm labourers, and they used to come down, both brothers, and they used to have a fight with one another. And then they used to go into the back of the angel tap, and make it up, buy one another a pint of Guinness or something like that.
Nowadays, banking and engineering design are the biggest employers, and employment in Knutsford is probably as varied as anywhere in England. The town of Knutsford is a significant tourist attraction and has become the fashionable eating place of the northwest. For something quite special, take the table for two between the marble pillars directly under the Gaskell Tower. Charles X had a passion for rare plants, and before he became King of France, he nearly lost his life in the swamps of Knutsford Moor, which was habitat to the rare Saxifraga hercules. The lily is now piped between the two moraines and would present no obstacle to King Canute as it runs through its channel to the Moor Pool. The lie of the moor is a mystery today because other than from the water tower, the church towers and the King's Coffee House, there are no vantage points from which to view the conservation area of the reed beds. Tatton Mere borders the top end of the Moor Pool at a boundary line drawn on the map, and if Watt could row a boat from Tatton back into Knutsford, he would find a modern development next to Drury Lane with an architecture sympathetic to that of his own. The architectural historian Nicholas Pevsner described Lee Road as the maddest sequence of villas in all England. However, the view in Knutsford is that Pevsner didn't understand Watt, and here they have continued his themes in many parts of the town. The history and traditions are uniquely Knutsford, and Joan has picked out a quotation which will strike a chord with many in the town.
For warmth, give me red Knutsford. It glows like a firelit room, full of pictures and heavy gold frames. It has nothing very grand, but the sum of all that has made it good to live in for the last 700 years.
We wish to thank Jasper's Leap for their recording of Knutsford races, Oliver Postgate for the medieval town of Thomas Becket, Fred McDowell for his postcards and photographs, Joan Leach for her history of the May Day, Alan Boone for the May Day video footage 1994 to 1997, Chester Record Office for the report on the Knutsford prison, Jeff Tenner for his watercolours and line drawings, Martin Rowson for Don Quixote and the Contraption, Knutsford Guardian for photographs of the 1997 election. The programme was researched and scripted by Peter J. Wilding. Production was by Iris Solutions.